Milestones of the Catholic Church, 19th century. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit and they shall be created. And you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, you instructed the hearts of those who believed in you by the light of the Holy Spirit. Grant us in the same Spirit to be truly wise and ever to rejoice in his consolation, through Christ our Lord. Amen. April 8, 1801. Korea. The Sinnu persecution begins. After the death of King Yeongjo in 1800, the regency of the Korean dynasty was temporarily given to his widow, Queen Yeongsoon, because the prince who was next in line to the throne was only 10 years old and too young to rule. At that time, Christianity was a minority religion and was largely seen with suspicion since it promoted values that were contrary to accepted Confucian custom. There was an existing law, however, that granted tolerance and allowed the Christians to practice their faith without any repercussions. Unfortunately, Queen Yeongsoon quickly overturns this law upon gaining power and bans Christianity across the country, initiating a nationwide crackdown against the Korean Catholic Church. This move, now known as the Sinnu persecution, was largely a cover-up so that Yeongsoon's own political crimes against her rivals would remain unnoticed. Although Yeongsoon herself would die 4 years later, hatred against Christians remained for several decades. The Sinnu persecution ended with the executions of over 300 Catholics, including renowned scholar Huang Sa-young, who attempted to smuggle letters to priests in China in order to ask for relief. 3 more major persecutions would follow, namely the Ki-hae persecution of 1839, the Pyong-o persecution of 1846, and the Pyongan persecution of 1866. Overall, approximately 50% of the entire Catholic population of Korea, or 10,000 men and women, were killed, a huge sacrifice that has led to several canonizations, making Korea the 4th country in the world with the highest number of saints. Andrew Kim Taegon and Paul Chung Ha-sang, 2 of the victims, are especially revered and are now celebrated in the liturgical calendar. Today, there are roughly 5.8 million Catholics in Korea, or 11% of the total population, which is a testament to the enduring nature of the faith, helped no doubt by the blood of the Korean martyrs who stood firm in Christ at the cost of their lives. July 15, 1801. Paris, France. Pius VII signs the Concordat of 1801. As a result of the French Revolution, multiple Catholics were executed and many were driven out of their homeland in France. In the bloody aftermath, Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then the first consul of the French Republic, sought to placate the remaining Catholics by coming into an agreement with the recently elected Pope Pius VII. In what would be known as the Concordat of 1801, both the French government and the Holy See hammered out a series of compromises in order to put an end to the hostilities. Specifically, the Holy See would relinquish all claims to the lands and properties that were forcibly confiscated during the Revolution, and all the bishops of France would have to be nominated by the state. In exchange, the French government would restore the rights of Catholics to public worship and pay the clergy a monthly salary as long as they swore allegiance to the nation. The Concordat effectively wiped out all the remaining animosity among Christians and secularists in France, as well as restored peace and order. However, the agreements in the contract leaned heavily in favor of the state, something that was criticized by the French bishops, almost none of whom were consulted by the Pope prior to the signing. Nevertheless, the Concordat of 1801 brought about a certain harmony and remained in force until the 1905 French law on the separation of the churches and the state superseded it. December 2, 1804. Paris, France. Napoleon Bonaparte is crowned Emperor of France. After a nationwide referendum was sent out, the French citizens almost unanimously approve of the decision to turn France from a republic into an empire with Napoleon Bonaparte as the king. His royal coronation was held in 1804 at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, with Pope Pius VII in attendance. Not wanting to be associated with the former kings of France, Napoleon designed a new coronation ceremony that significantly departed from his predecessors. Specifically, it included elements from many other traditions and was a mixture of both Catholic and secular rites. Napoleon was also emphatic that he would place the crown upon his own head, rather than the usual custom of receiving the crown from the hands of the archbishop, symbolizing the fact that his coronation was the result of his own merits and not that of the church. Pius VII had an extremely limited role in the ceremony and retired early to his quarters in objection to the coronation oath that was drafted by Napoleon. His disapproval, however, was largely kept to himself and was not voiced out in protest. This tenuous peace between Pius VII and Napoleon would not last long, as France would wage war against the Papal States a mere 5 years later, leading to Napoleon's excommunication and the arrest of Pius VII as a prisoner of war. Napoleon was permanently defeated at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and died at the age of 51 from an unknown illness while in exile. Meanwhile, Pope Pius VII was hailed as a living martyr and defender of the faith after his return from captivity, dying at the age of 81 from complications of a hip fracture. Despite having to deal with Napoleon his entire life, Pius VII always considered him a friend, calling him a somewhat stubborn son, but a son still. For his part, the humiliating military defeat gave Napoleon enough time to contemplate religion, and before his death, he made the decision to be reconciled with the Catholic Church, a request that Pius VII personally granted by sending a priest to him, the Abbé Vinali, from whom Napoleon received the sacrament of confession and was absolved of all his sins. Written on his last will and testament were the words, "I die in the bosom of the Apostolic and Roman Church," and one of his final statements was, "I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ is not a man." Napoleon has long been debated as either an egotistical tyrant who brought massive amounts of death and destruction to the world, or a pioneering ruler who laid the foundations of the modern rights and privileges enjoyed by the Western nations, but the end of his life and his eventual return to the arms of the Church gives everyone hope that God's mercy is so bountiful that he can forgive even the worst of sinners. As far as the final judgment in the eyes of eternity is concerned, this might be the real legacy that Napoleon left behind. August 6, 1806. Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire dissolves. Even though ancient Rome had long collapsed in the 5th century AD, its spiritual successor called the Holy Roman Empire continued well into the 19th century. The emperors who ruled the Holy Roman Empire considered themselves to be heirs to the throne of Caesar. Likewise, the Pope who crowned the emperors was seen as the vicar of Christ himself here on earth. As such, even though the emperor and the Pope didn't really have much territorial control or military power, both of them were recognized as the joint secular and spiritual rulers over the entire Christian world by virtue of their prestige and preeminence. Since much of the European nations were Catholic, this status quo was upheld over many centuries, surviving even the 30 Years' War and the Protestant Schism. Finally, at the start of the 19th century, the concept of the Holy Roman Empire, and the idea of universal jurisdiction over all of the Christian nations, became too much to accept by many governing rulers, who questioned the legitimacy of such a bold claim and advocated instead that each country had a right to govern itself without having to ask permission from either the Pope or the Emperor. The final blow came after the Holy Roman Empire and its vassal states got involved in a war with France, which led to their catastrophic military defeat at the hands of Napoleon. The last Holy Roman Emperor, Francis II, abdicated his throne in August 1806 and dissolved the entire imperial hierarchy and its institutions, effectively ending the Holy Roman Empire once and for all, a move that was seen as necessary in order to prevent Napoleon from crowning himself as king of the Christian world. This sudden dissolution of the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire, an institution that began with Charlemagne in 800 AD, was met with horror by many of the world's Catholics, especially those living in Vienna and Germany. Some people, such as the peasant and working classes, simply refused to believe the news, thinking that it was a ploy by the aristocrats. Those who did believe interpreted it as the beginning of the end times. In the aftermath of the collapse, many former nations that once belonged to the empire either consolidated their own monarchies or adopted a republic style of government, leading to the rise of the modern-day independent nation-states. Although there were several attempts at restoring the Holy Roman Empire after Napoleon's defeat, they never came to fruition, and today, even though the Christian world still has a universal spiritual leader in the form of the Pope, a universal secular leader has never been re-established. February 9, 1818. Ars, France. John Vianney spiritually transforms the town of Ars. One of the difficulties of being a priest is the relative apathy of the parishioners, who often treat religion as something that's part of the routine of daily life, rather than as an avenue for a radical spiritual transformation. Because of this, many young clerics become disillusioned and lose the initial fire that they once had, treating their vocation as nothing more than another job instead of the divine calling to save souls. Sometimes, however, the opposite happens, and a priest who's in love with Christ can create such a profound impact that it changes the lives of those around him, even the most ardent unbelievers. This was the case with Jean-Baptiste Marie Vianney. Growing up in the anti-clerical phase of the French Revolution, Vianney began to admire the priests and nuns who risked their lives to minister to the people. When Napoleon and Pope Pius VII signed the Concordat of 1801 and re-established the Catholic Church in France, Vianney decided that he was going to become a priest as well. This was often a great challenge because he was mentally slow, and his situation was further complicated when the Napoleonic Wars erupted, forcing him to go into hiding in order to avoid being drafted into the French army. Vianney was finally ordained in 1815 and only after the insistence of the local abbot, who claimed that Vianney's spiritual piety would more than make up for his intellectual stupidity. 3 years later, he was sent into the relatively backwards French town of Ars, hence his title as the curé, or parish priest, of Ars. Ars only had 230 inhabitants, and the vast majority of them spent their time drinking and dancing. Vianney was so scandalized by this lack of concern for the spiritual life that he spent his Sunday sermons preaching heavily against vice. He also threatened to withhold absolution from those who refused to give up their bad habits. At first, the townspeople found Vianney's fire and brimstone homilies as well as his strict adherence to morality to be too much to handle, but as the months dragged on, they slowly warmed up to him. This was due to the fact that Vianney had a genuine concern for the salvation of the parishioners under his care. He made it a point to visit each and every one of them in their homes in order to get to know them better and help them in whatever way he can, making his honest intentions clear for everyone to witness. Vianney himself also practiced severe mortifications of the flesh, serving as a good example for the townspeople. He ate extremely bland food, slept very few hours at night on the bare floor, and even chastised himself with bits of metal and iron hoods. Eventually, reports of Vianney's holiness spread far and wide, and by 1855, 20,000 pilgrims would come to Ars just to receive the sacraments from him, forcing the French government to build a dedicated railroad track in order to accommodate them. At the height of his popularity, Vianney would spend 12 to 18 hours a day in the confessional, since the line of people waiting to receive absolution was immensely long. John Vianney died at the age of 73 from natural causes and was canonized as a saint by Pope Pius XI in 1925. His body was later exhumed and found to be incorrupt. As a result of this, it is currently on display right above the main altar in the Basilica at Ars. Once a humble nobody who was almost denied ordination because of his lack of talents, Vianney is now recognized as the patron saint of parish priests, proving that the only thing needed for young men wanting to serve Christ and set the world on fire is an ardent love of souls, and the desire to reunite them with the God who made them for himself. April 7, 1824. Vienna, Austrian Empire. Ludwig van Beethoven composes Missa Solemnis. The city of Vienna has often been called the City of Music, and a big reason for this is that it was the place where legendary composer Ludwig van Beethoven created many of his masterpieces. Beethoven was raised in a family of musicians, and his parents sought to turn him into a child prodigy by subjecting him to an intense training regimen that often reduced the young Beethoven to tears. The severity of his musical education, the alcoholism of his father, and various household problems led to an unhappy childhood, which Beethoven was finally able to escape after reaching the age of maturity. His talents began to blossom and attract the attention of famous composers and patrons at that time, many of whom considered him to be the spiritual successor of the recently deceased Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Beethoven did not disappoint, and several important works soon followed, such as his Symphony No. 1 and his Violin Concerto. A baptized Catholic, Beethoven's greatest contribution to the church would be the Missa Solemnis in D major, a musical piece that is meant to be sung for the full ceremonial form of the Tridentine Mass, also known as the High Mass. Although many other famous composers have their own versions, Beethoven's is generally recognized as the best and most popular. Missa Solemnis was dedicated to the Archduke Rudolph of Austria, a cardinal and personal friend of Beethoven, and it was performed in its full form in 1824 at St. Petersburg. Beethoven died at the age of 56 from an unknown illness, and his funeral procession was attended by approximately 10,000 people. What sets him apart from the rest of his peers was the fact that he was almost completely deaf when he composed his most famous pieces, including Missa Solemnis, a feat that is remarkable in itself, but especially poignant considering that the nature of his work required him to hear the notes. Beethoven compensated for his deafness by imagining the music purely in his head, and for this, he is remembered not only as a stellar composer, but as a testament to the human will's divine potential, even in the face of crippling adversity. July 5, 1830. Baghdad, Iraq. The Chaldean Church reunites with the Roman Catholic Church. During the 5th century AD, there arose strenuous debate among the bishops as to the nature of Christ. One of the figures, Nestorius, advocated a position that Jesus had two essences, divine and human, which were distinctly separate from each other. This theological concept was formally condemned at the Council of Ephesus that confirmed the dogma of the hypostatic union. Nestorius also refused to call the Virgin Mary by the title, the Mother of God, among other controversies. He was branded as a heretic, but he quickly found a place of refuge among Christians in the Church of the East, also known as the Persian Church, who was sympathetic with him. This sheltering of Nestorius led to the embittered schism of the Persian Church from the Roman Catholic Church that lasted for several centuries. Multiple attempts at reconciliation were made, none of which were successful in the long term. Finally, in 1830, several members of the Persian Church denounced their Nestorian heritage and asked to be reunited with the Pope. They were given the official name the Chaldean Catholic Church based on their language and ethnicity, and Yohanan VIII Hormez was declared as the first patriarch in an unbroken succession that lasts to this day. The episcopal seat of the Chaldean Church is the Cathedral of Our Lady of Sorrows, located in Baghdad and consecrated in 1898. The Chaldean bishops and priests minister to Arab Catholics primarily living in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, with a total membership of approximately 500,000 people. Because the Middle East is often rife with religious and sectarian violence, the Chaldean Catholic Church serves as a modern-day bulwark that keeps the forces of darkness at bay and makes sure that the gospel of Christ has a stable foothold in an area of the world that's in dire need of His graces. November 27, 1830. Paris, France. Catherine Labouré receives the Miraculous Medal. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars contributed to massive amounts of turmoil in France, making it an extremely volatile nation that was the source of many troubles in Western Europe. In the first of three major Marian apparitions occurring in this country over the course of the 19th century, the Virgin Mary appeared to a nun named Catherine Labouré, a religious member of the Daughters of Charity. Awoken late one evening by the voice of a child, Catherine followed the noise and ended up in the Order's chapel, wherein she heard a woman telling her to prepare for an important mission. This mission was given 4 months later when, during her nightly meditation, she received a vision and saw the Blessed Mother displaying herself in an oval frame, standing on the earth with rays of light surrounding her. Around the frame were the words, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." The frame rotated, and on the opposite side were 12 stars, a cross, the letter M, and the two Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. The Blessed Mother then ordered Catherine to take these images and stamp them on a medallion to be distributed to the faithful around the world as a sacramental from which they would derive graces for help in times of need. Catherine did so with the permission of her confessor, but it took another 2 years of investigation before the Catholic Church formally approved of the apparition. The images that Catherine described were taken to a goldsmith named Adrien Vachette, who created the design for what is now known as the Miraculous Medal. Millions of copies were soon forged and handed out to the laity, where they proved to be extremely popular. The apparition also served a crucial role in Pope Pius IX's declaration of the Immaculate Conception 24 years later, since the slogan of the medal boldly proclaiming that Mary was conceived without sin strengthened the argument in favor of the dogma. Catherine Labouré died at the age of 70 from natural causes. She was later canonized as a saint by Pope Pius XII in 1947 after her body was discovered to be incorrupt. It is now encased in a glass coffin and enshrined beneath the side altar in the chapel of Our Lady of the Miraculous Medal for public viewing and veneration. July 14, 1833. Oxford, England. The Oxford movement begins. A growing discontent in the Anglican or Church of England was beginning to ferment in the early 19th century, spurred largely by the suspicion that the political administration at that time known as the Whigs was interfering too much in religious affairs. Many Anglicans were also disturbed by the lack of respect and reverence in the liturgy and called for the reinstatement of various ecclesiastical traditions that were removed after the English Reformation in the 16th century when Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church. This movement to revive some of the pre-Reformation practices became known as the Oxford Movement, and its proponents argued that the Anglican Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Orthodox Church were in fact three branches of the one, Holy, Apostolic Church. Hence, it was not at all at odds with the Anglican doctrines if they adopted many of the lost practices of the medieval and early church periods. The majority of Englishmen viewed the Oxford movement with contempt, calling it a thinly veiled attempt to overthrow the established Church of England and bring the Roman Catholic Church back into prominence. This accusation was not exactly without merits, as many members of the Oxford movement soon realized that the branch theory was a lie, and that there cannot be three apostolic churches but only one. Because of this, multiple conversions happened, the most famous of which was John Henry Newman's, but also that of Gerard Manley Hopkins's and Henry Edward Manning's, all three of whom would become future Catholic priests or cardinals. Even though not everyone in the Oxford movement became a Catholic, it had a profound effect on the Anglican Church, bringing it closer to the rites, rituals, and customs of Roman Catholicism, even to the extent of forming their own religious orders that closely mimics that of the Catholic churches. Nevertheless, the Church of England still remains in schism to this day, and until it renounces many of its enshrined doctrines and restores its communion with the papacy, all of its outward appearances will continue to fall short of the fullness of Christ's body. December 3, 1839. Vatican City. Gregory XVI condemns the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery as an institutional practice has long been present in both the ancient and modern world, but its barbarism reached particular heights in the 16th to 19th centuries as human traffickers captured millions of Central and West Africans in order to sell them to wealthier nations, most notably in the North and South Americas. This became known as the Atlantic slave trade, and the men and women who were sold were considered as commodities and became the legal properties of their buyers. In 1839, at the behest of multiple abolitionists in Britain, Pope Gregory XVI released his papal bull In Supremo Apostolatus, or in the Supreme Apostolate, unequivocally condemning slavery and prohibiting any clergyman or lay person from participating in it. The bull was published worldwide but was met with apathy from Catholic slaveholders who continued in their crimes. Some bishops in the United States even took the stance of privately opposing slavery, but publicly refusing to combat the political laws that were keeping it in place. It also didn't help that the papal bull contained fairly ambiguous language as to whether or not small-scale or individual slavery was to be lumped in the same prohibition, which led to a loophole that many pro-slavery Catholics managed to exploit in order to justify their actions. Pope Gregory XVI died at the age of 80 from facial erysipelas, and although the Atlantic slave trade would continue for a few more years, it was later legally condemned as the abolitionists slowly gained power across multiple countries and passed laws criminalizing the practice. The last Western nation to ban slavery was Brazil in 1888, permanently ending the Atlantic slave trade. Apologies from the various governments have since been issued, but the effects of slavery are still present in the 21st century, especially among the displaced descendants of the men and women who were unjustly kidnapped and forced to work against their will by those who failed to see the image of God in them. November 26, 1842. Indiana, USA. The University of Notre Dame is founded. The Bishop of Indiana contacted the Congregation of the Holy Cross in the mid-19th century in order to complain about the lack of Catholic education in the state. The congregation responded by sending over Reverend Edward Sorin, along with 8 other brothers from France and Ireland, in 1842, with the mission of building a college within the next couple of years. Sorin was given approximately 524 acres of land, and the University of Notre Dame du Lac, or the University of Our Lady of the Lake, was born. It started out as an old log chapel catering to all male primary and secondary school students before slowly expanding throughout the decades, becoming an official college in 1844 and admitting females in 1972, who used to go to the nearby sister school called St. Mary's College. Notre Dame is home to several iconic landmarks such as the Golden Dome Administration Building, the Word of Life mural, Notre Dame Stadium, and the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. Its football team, the Fighting Irish, rose to prominence during the tenure of famed athletic coach Knute Rockne. Notre Dame is currently one of the largest, richest, and best Catholic universities in the United States, renowned for its stellar undergraduate program, especially the School of Architecture. It continues to expand and has produced more than 130,000 graduates, including several politicians, Nobel Prize winners, entertainment celebrities, professional athletes, NASA astronauts, and businessmen. October 9, 1845. Oxford, England. John Henry Newman converts to Catholicism. A huge proponent and one of the leaders of the Oxford movement, John Henry Newman's goal in his younger days was to have the Church of England incorporate and re-assimilate various Catholic medieval rituals and practices that had been dropped since the English Reformation, in order to reconnect Anglicans with their historical roots. He even went so far as to argue that the doctrines espoused in the Catholic Council of Trent were entirely compatible with the 39 Anglican Articles of Religion. By 1845, however, it became clear to him that this position was untenable, and that he had to pick one church over the other. Newman eventually came to the conclusion that the Church of England lacked the necessary grace and apostolic authority to be considered a part of the one true church founded by Christ, so he formally left it and converted to Roman Catholicism, where he was quickly ordained as a priest and later elevated to the rank of cardinal. This move scandalized many of his fellow Englishmen and academic contemporaries, who branded Newman as a traitor for going against the state religion. Nevertheless, Newman was undeterred and continued to work in England. He was a prolific writer, penning some famous works such as his autobiography Apologia pro vita sua, or A Defense of One's Own Life, and the popular hymn, Lead, Kindly Light. Most of all, he became an ardent and eloquent defender of the Catholic faith, something that often landed him in trouble with the authorities due to the widespread anti-Catholic sentiment that raged in his country. By the time of his death at the age of 89 from pneumonia, his accomplishments in the field of religious education were undeniable, and his popular maxim, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant," is widely used today to indicate that the ancient historical tradition of the Catholic Church that stretches back 2,000 years is one of the most effective tools in trying to convince non-Catholic Christians of the invalidity of their position. Newman was canonized as a saint by Pope Francis in 2019. September 19, 1846. La Salette Farlavaux, France. the Virgin Mary appears to Maximin Giraud and Melanie Calvert. In a century that was rife with political strife, economic hardships, and several wars, the divine providence of heaven deemed it necessary to intervene in order to give a stern warning to men and women, urging them to change their ways or else reap the consequences of their actions. One of the most striking examples of this chastisement was the appearance of the Virgin Mary in 1846, the second of three major Marian apparitions that occurred in France in the 19th century, to two shepherd children named Maximin Giraud and Melanie Calvert, who were minding cows at a mountain on a Saturday evening. They saw a beautiful lady sitting down with her face buried in her hands and weeping bitterly. The lady then gave them a message to relay to the rest of the people, namely to stop profaning the Lord's name and the Lord's day, as well as a more detailed prophecy concerning the European nations and the troubles and hopes that were to come in the succeeding decades. Both Giraud and Calvert were also given revelations that were private in nature, which they never exposed except to Pope Pius IX. When questioned by the authorities, the young visionaries gave consistent and detailed descriptions, leading the Church to definitively declare the apparition, now known as Our Lady of La Salette, as authentic and worthy of belief. Many Catholics were struck by the dire warnings given by the Virgin Mary, and future saints John Vianney and John Bosco held a personal devotion for the La Salette apparition. Maximin Giraud went on to various ventures, including a stint in the French corps, before succumbing to an unknown illness at the age of 39. Melanie Calvert became a nun and was involved in several political controversies before dying of natural causes at the age of 73. The appearance of Our Lady of La Salette is noteworthy from the other Marian apparitions for its urgent call for repentance, symbolized by the weeping of the Virgin Mary herself, as well as the guaranteed promise of divine mercy for those who would repent. Despite the specific prophecies already having run their course, the core La Salette message of sin and forgiveness is still more than relevant for Christians and non-Christians all over the world today. July 23, 1847. Jerusalem, Ottoman Empire. Pius IX re-establishes the Catholic Church's hierarchy in Jerusalem. Many important places around the world that were once strongholds of the Catholic Church slowly became secular in nature or were taken over by other religions due to the political upheavals throughout the centuries. Jerusalem was one of these places. Originally the birthplace of the Catholic Church, its episcopal seat was first held by James the Just, traditionally recognized as one of the apostles and the first bishop of Jerusalem. This lasted until 1054 when the Great East-West Schism took place, and the Christians in Jerusalem soon broke with the Pope and fell under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The episcopacy was quickly restored in 1099 when the Roman Crusaders liberated Jerusalem from Muslim rule and expelled the Orthodox Patriarch, but this was short-lived as the Muslims launched a counterattack and effectively wiped out any traces of the Catholic Church. Hundreds of years would pass before the governing Jerusalem authorities would once again allow Christians to freely worship in its lands, and this happened in 1847 when Pope Pius IX managed to obtain permission from the Ottoman Sultan to re-establish Catholic Church's hierarchy in Jerusalem. Giuseppe Verlerga was therefore appointed as the new Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the co-cathedral of the Most Holy Name of Jesus, a beautiful neo-Gothic architectural marvel with a Greek cross-floor plan, was quickly constructed and consecrated to serve as his episcopal seat. Today, despite continuous turmoil and various changes in the ruling powers of the Holy Land, the Jerusalem episcopacy still stands strong, serving approximately 300,000 Catholics spread out over 66 parishes, in the exact place where Christ and the Apostles once ministered over 2 millennia ago. January 6, 1848. Vatican City. Pius IX urges the Eastern Orthodox Christians to reunify with the Catholic Church. The Great East-West Schism of 1054 led to the splitting of the Church between the Latin or Roman Catholic Church and the Greek or Eastern Orthodox Church. In 1848, 2 years after being elected Pope, Pius IX wrote the apostolic letter now commonly known as the Epistle to the Easterners, urging the bishops and faithful on the other side of the world to reunify with the West. This apostolic letter was notable for being the first to demonstrate a certain degree of urgency and concern for the separated Christians not in full communion with Rome. As such, Pius IX ordered that the letter be translated into Greek and that thousands of copies be distributed directly into the hands of the Orthodox faithful. The response of the Orthodox bishops was extremely negative, accusing Pius IX of missionizing in their territory and sowing discord. A counter-letter was issued titled Encyclical of the Eastern Patriarchs, which reiterated the Orthodox Church's claim that papal supremacy and the Filioque clause are both heresies, and that the Catholic Church is schismatic. Although the back-and-forth arguments failed to cause much of a change in either camp, Pius IX's vision of a unified Christian world was carried over to the First Vatican Council, and ultimately found much traction in the Second Vatican Council 100 years later, wherein the Catholic Church made considerable ecumenical efforts in order to unify or at least reach a cordial agreement with the Eastern Orthodox Church and other denominations, solidifying the friendships between the different traditions despite the major differences involved. September 29, 1850. London, England. Pius IX re-establishes the Catholic Church's hierarchy in England. Catholics in the United Kingdom have always been on the receiving end of numerous persecutions and discriminations, ever since King Henry VIII declared the Church of England's independence from the papacy in 1534. Catholicism was effectively banned at that period, and multiple priests and laypeople were tortured and put to death in the succeeding centuries. A great legal boon came about in 1829 as the United Kingdom's Parliament enacted the Roman Catholic Relief Act, which was the start of many reforms that attempted to give back some of the fundamental human rights that Catholics have been deprived of. As a result of this, the number of Catholics in England ballooned from thousands to millions, prompting Pope Pius IX to reinstate the normal diocesan hierarchy, which had largely gone underground, through a papal bull titled Universalis Ecclesia, or of the Universal Church. This normalizing of Roman Catholicism in the largely Anglican Protestant England resulted in a huge public backlash that included vandalisms of church property, burning of effigies, and anti-Catholic letters and processions, but the Pope stood firm and appointed a metropolitan archbishop as well as 12 other suffragan bishops over various territories. Construction soon began on the Westminster Cathedral, a brick masterpiece designed by architect John Francis Bentley in a neo-Byzantine style, so that it could serve as the seat. All of these areas were new, however, because English law forbade the Catholic Church from using the names of the dioceses from the pre-Reformation era, since the Anglicans were already holding their titles. Nevertheless, the Roman Catholic Relief Act was met with great rejoicing from the English Catholics, including the likes of John Henry Newman, who famously declared that a second temple rises on the ruins of the old. In his first pastoral letter, the freshly elected Archbishop Nicholas Wiseman also stated, "Catholic England has been restored to its orbit in the ecclesiastical firmament." Today, the Catholic Church still maintains its presence in a largely suspicious part of Western Europe, always ready to assert itself and prove that she can only be temporarily stopped by powers and principalities, but never permanently destroyed. May 9, 1852. Maryland, USA. The plenary councils of Baltimore are convened. The Catholic Church in the United States of America grew out of the missionary zeal of many Spanish, French, and Mexican evangelists who went to the New World in an effort to spread the Christian faith. During the colonial era, there weren't enough Catholics in the United States, so all the dioceses formed only one ecclesiastical province that was directly under the Archbishop of Baltimore. As the population steadily increased by the mid-1800s and more provinces were formed, it became essential for the bishops to hold a national or plenary council in order to streamline the rules, laws, and governance of the Catholic Church in America. The Pope granted this request, and the first plenary council of Baltimore was held in 1852, presided over by Archbishop Francis Kenrick. Two others followed in 1866 and 1884 respectively. A significant decision that resulted from these councils was the Latae Sententiae excommunications of American Catholics who attempted to remarry after obtaining a civil divorce, as well as those who tried to obtain marriage through a non-Catholic minister. These excommunications were in full force well into the 20th century, although they were later retroactively lifted by Pope Paul VI in the 1970s. Today, the plenary councils of Baltimore have largely been forgotten and superseded by more recent rulings, but they served as an important predecessor to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, or USCCB, that is currently active, and still remains as a key example of the importance of priests and bishops having a unified front when it comes to guiding the Church that is under their domain. December 8, 1854. Vatican City. The Immaculate Conception is declared as a dogma. Although the Virgin Mary's freedom from personal sin had already been firmly established even as early as the 4th century, her freedom from original sin was still the subject of debate up to the modern era. Original sin is the inherited condition of fallen humanity that is passed down to every generation due to the disobedience of our first parents Adam and Eve. Famous doctors of the Church like Saints Thomas Aquinas and Bernard of Clairvaux rejected the idea of Mary being born sinless, stating that if this is the case, then she would not have needed Christ to be redeemed, which is impossible since Mary is only a creature and not God. This apparent logical contradiction was solved in the Middle Ages by the theologian Duns Scotus, who stated that Mary was indeed saved from original sin by the merits of Christ, but through pre-redemption in anticipation of his death rather than post-redemption. In other words, while the rest of humanity was saved after the crucifixion, Mary was saved before the crucifixion because of her special union with Jesus. This breakthrough made the concept of the Immaculate Conception possible, but it wasn't until 1854 when Pope Pius IX officially declared it as a dogma with the release of his apostolic constitution Ineffabilis Deus, or Ineffable God. The announcement came in the midst of a great Marian revival due to Catherine Labourè's reception of the miraculous medal, as well as the personal devotion and support of multiple Catholic monarchs and bishops. While the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is technically considered an ex cathedra statement, this was made at a time when the concept of papal infallibility hasn't yet been formally established. Therefore, it was received with overwhelming negativity from both the Protestant and Eastern Orthodox churches, including several Roman Catholic circles, who condemned it as an abuse of the Pope's authority. Nevertheless, the dogma was vindicated 4 years later when Mary herself appeared to a young girl named Bernadette Soubirous and introduced herself as the Immaculate Conception, proving that the successor of Peter really does have the ability to bind and loose both the things of heaven and the things of earth. 1856. Brunn, Austria-Hungary. Gregor Mendel formulates the rules of heredity. Born into a poor farming family, Gregor Johann Mendel entered the religious life largely out of necessity, since monks at that time were allowed to receive an education without having to pay for it themselves. Mendel took advantage of this opportunity and soon studied multiple fields including physics, meteorology, mathematics, and above all, biology. Even as an adult, his childhood love for farming never left him, and when he was assigned to St. Thomas's Abbey in Brunn, he decided to cultivate a rather large number of pea plants in the monastery's garden. Farmers have known for centuries that cross-breeding plants and animals would yield certain beneficial or negative traits in the offspring, but no one has ever been able to identify just what the rules governing this process involved. Mendel's scientific curiosity soon put the matter to rest as he made multiple experiments with his pea plants, meticulously noting the specific characteristics that were passed on from one generation to the next. His experiments lasted for 7 years from 1856 all the way up to 1863, and by the time he was finished, he had managed to cross-pollinate approximately 28,000 plants. The enormous amount of data that was gathered led him to formulate the rules of heredity, now known as the laws of Mendelian inheritance, which allowed him to accurately predict exactly what type of physical qualities a future child will have, based on the physical qualities of its parents. Mendel published his findings in a paper titled Experiments on Plant Hybridization, wherein he explained what is now known as the field of genetics, coining such phrases as dominant and recessive, which is still used by biologists today when talking about genes. Unfortunately, the paper was widely ignored by his contemporaries, and Mendel's scientific career was also cut short due to other commitments when he was elected abbot of the monastery. He later died in obscurity at the age of 61 from chronic nephritis. Although his genius was unrecognized during his lifetime, future scientists managed to unearth his papers and confirm their groundbreaking significance. Gregor Mendel is now known as the father of modern genetics, and he is widely credited for launching this new field of study that has yielded tremendous benefits for humanity as a whole. December 8, 1856. Lyon, France. Melchior de Marion Brissac founds the Society of African Missions. There are certain men whose ideas are way ahead of their time, and Melchior Marie Joseph de Marion Brissac was one of those men. Ordained to the priesthood at an early age, the young Brissac served as a parish priest in his hometown of Castelnaudary until he felt an irresistible urge to become a foreign missionary. This move was strongly opposed by his father, so much so that Brissac was forced to leave his family without even saying goodbye. He soon migrated to India, where he put into action what was at that time a groundbreaking idea of ordaining indigenous Indian priests so that the locals will become self-sustaining in their practice of Christianity, ending the need for immigrant missionaries entirely. Unfortunately, this democratic style of leadership was strongly opposed by his fellow European clergymen, who wanted to keep a strict power hierarchy with them at the top. Even more appalling was their absolute refusal to stand up against the Indian caste system, which Brissac found revolting because it designated certain groups of people as untouchables, something that he felt was contrary to the Gospel's message of universal brotherhood. Brissac resigned after he failed to penetrate the stubborn hearts of his fellow priests and returned to France, where he decided to start anew. Still feeling called to missionary life, Brissac founded the Society of African Missions, deciding to focus all of his efforts in evangelizing the African continent. He and his recruits traveled to Sierra Leone in 1859, but sadly, they all contracted trench fever. Brissac died a mere 6 weeks after he had set foot in Africa. Luckily, his friend and spiritual advisor Father Augustin Planck took leadership of the Society of African Missions. Today, the Society has around 856 members in 5 provinces around the world. What's even more surprising is that the vast number of Catholic missionaries in the Society are now of African descent, vindicating Brissac's revolutionary concept of building self-reliance in Christian communities so that they can function effectively even without the presence of foreign-born evangelists. Melchior de Marion Brissac's cause for canonization is currently ongoing. February 11, 1858. Lourdes, France. The Virgin Mary appears to Bernadette Soubirous. While gathering firewood with her sister and neighbor, 14-year-old Bernadette Soubirous wandered towards the grotto of Massabielle and received the shock of her life when a mysterious young maiden suddenly appeared in front of her. The woman was no older than Bernadette and was wearing a white dress with a blue girdle, standing on top of 2 yellow roses, and carrying a rosary in her hands, inviting Soubirous to pray with her. Bernadette was so frightened that she was unable to make the sign of the cross and even attempted on another occasion to throw holy water at the figure, just to make sure that it wasn't diabolic in origin. Word got around, and Soubirous was soon ordered by her elders not to make any more trips to the grotto, an order that she did not follow. Eventually, the lady specifically introduced herself as the Immaculate Conception and told Bernadette to dig a hole in the ground. She did so and soon unearthed a spring hidden beneath the soil. The newly discovered spring started to attract pilgrims, and miraculous cures were attributed to it as more and more people drank from its waters, prompting the French government to fence off the area for fear of a possible contamination. While the Catholic Church tried to avoid giving comments on the apparition, they were soon forced to launch an official inquiry as the matter became a nationwide concern. On January 18, 1860, the local bishop finally confirmed the veracity of the event, making it the 3rd major Marian apparition that occurred in France in the 19th century. Emperor Napoleon III also intervened and reopened the shrine, and French sculptor Joseph Hugues Faubich was contracted to create an icon of the Virgin Mary based on Bernadette's description, which became famously known as Our Lady of Lourdes. Bernadette Soubirous died of tuberculosis at the age of 35 and was later canonized as a saint by Pope Pius XI in 1933. Lourdes is now a major Catholic pilgrimage site, and over 5 million people visit the grotto every year in order to drink from the spring dug up by Bernadette over a century ago. Its waters still supply healing to weary travelers wanting to connect with God through His Blessed Mother to this very day. 1859. Vatican City. Pius IX orders the Alta Vendita to be published. In the mid-19th century, an Italian underground society called the Carbonari, or charcoal makers, was intent on establishing a constitutional government, and one of the institutions that they deemed as a hindrance to this goal was the Catholic Church. A document was therefore distributed among the Carbonari members containing detailed plans to overthrow the papacy by means of Carbonari spies posing as clergymen, infiltrating the church hierarchy, and destroying the institution from the inside. This operation was to be carried out over many decades. In 1859, Pope Pius IX became aware of this document and ordered it to be published so that the entire Catholic world would be forewarned about this attempted subversion. The book was titled The Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, named after one of the Carbonari lodges where the scheme originated from. Although the Carbonari never managed to completely overthrow the papacy thanks to the publication of their plans, they did manage to gain a significant influence within the episcopacy before they disbanded. The Alta Vendita is still being read today, mostly in traditionalist circles, because it accurately describes what some Catholics have considered to be the current situation of the Church, especially in the post-Vatican II era. December 10, 1859. Manila, Philippines. Ateneo de Manila University is founded. The colonizing of the Philippines by the then Catholic nation of Spain brought with it a huge influx of missionaries and religious orders, one of which was the Society of Jesus or Jesuits. Some of the wealthy Spaniards who have settled in that region of the world was in dire need of an educational facility for their kids. In 1859, at the behest of the Governor-General Fernando Norzagaray y Escudero, the Jesuits took it upon themselves to make one, commandeering the local municipal school of Manila and changing its name to Ateneo de Manila. Throughout the span of several decades, the school grew from a small primary institution for the children of Spanish elites into an internationally recognized university for higher education. After the overthrow of the Spanish colonialists in 1898, Ateneo became open to both the local Filipino people as well as foreign exchange students. It has since produced 5 presidents, 5 chief justices, 6 national artists, 1 national scientist, and 2 Ramon Magsaysay awardees. Its most famous alumni is José Rizal, the Philippines' national hero and cultural icon. Today, Ateneo de Manila is considered the best Catholic university in the country and has expanded its campuses to several branches all across the nation's archipelago. December 18, 1859. Turin, Kingdom of Italy. John Bosco founds the Society of St. Francis de Sales. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars caused numerous famines and shortages to erupt all over the Italian peninsula, which became a huge problem for the poverty-stricken farmers of that region. One of these farmers was John Melchior Bosco, who was forced to leave his home and find more meaningful work at the young age of 12. He was soon taken in by a priest named Joseph Cafasso, and this act of kindness inspired John to become a priest himself, eventually becoming ordained and given the honorific title Don, which means father, in Italian. As part of his apostolate, Don Bosco would go to prisons in order to minister to the convicts, and he was alarmed to find that a large number of them were minors between the ages of 12 and 18 years old. This rise in adolescent violence was a consequence of the recent Industrial Revolution that caused a huge spike in the city's slum population and a sharp increase in petty crime because of wealth disparity. The penal system at that time was content to simply lock up these offending youths in jail, but Don Bosco wanted to find a better way. Inspired by a dream that he had, wherein a divine figure told him that he would win more people over with kindness rather than ruthlessness, Bosco soon began rounding up street juveniles and giving them food, clothing, shelter, and the vocational skills necessary to earn a livelihood. This demonstration of supreme charity often ended up badly for Bosco, as many of the youths took advantage of his hospitality and stole his supplies. He was also evicted multiple times because his neighbors viewed the large gathering of rowdy boys as a threat to the peace and order of the community and a breeding ground for revolution. Throughout all this, Bosco never lost hope, and his efforts paid off when Pope Pius IX lent his support to Bosco's vision of helping young people overcome sin and vice, leading to the formation of the Society of St. Francis de Sales in 1859, a religious order named after a doctor of the Church whom Bosco had a huge admiration for. The men who joined Bosco in his work became known as the Salesians, whose religious calling is to gather wayward children and give them all the opportunities necessary so that they can serve Christ, the Church, and the world to the best of their abilities. Bosco also partnered with Mary Mazzarello in forming the group Daughters of Mary Help of Christians, which is the female counterpart of the Salesians. One of the greatest successes of the order was Dominic Savio, a personal student of Bosco who was declared a saint at the age of 14, one of the youngest ever, as a result of his holiness and Bosco's guidance. John Bosco died at the age of 72 from acute bronchitis and was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1934. Today, both the male and female branches of the society have almost 30,000 members worldwide, and the Salesian preventive system that uses reason, religion, and loving-kindness in order to reach out and reform street children, orphans, underprivileged youths, and teenage gang members, continues to fulfill Christ's universal mandate to let the little ones come to him without any hindrance. 1866. South Australia, Australia. Mary MacKillop and Julian Tennyson Woods co-found the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart. Newly ordained priest Julian Edmund Tennyson Woods was put in charge of the parish of Penola in South Australia, and there, he found the lack of educational facilities for the locals as something that needed to be addressed. After meeting a teacher named Mary Helen MacKillop, the pair decided to take the initiative and open their own Catholic school. Woods became the director while MacKillop and her two sisters Annie and Lexi served as the educators. The school started off in a stable that was renovated by MacKillop's brother, and approximately 50 children became their first enrollees. Several other women joined their endeavor, and MacKillop decided to dedicate herself entirely to God, taking on the religious name Sister Mary of the Cross and reforming the group into the religious order called the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart. The order continued their teaching endeavors while receiving permission from the bishop. MacKillop and Woods drafted the order's rule, which emphasized poverty, a reliance on divine providence, and a willingness to go where they were most needed. This strict way of life led to a huge expansion of the sisters' educational efforts, as MacKillop and the other members were not afraid to go to railways, mines, farms, and even the deserted Australian outback to spread their mission. They eventually branched out beyond education and started setting up orphanages, charity works, and homes for the aged. Stiff resistance and political bickering soon followed, as many of the bishops and priests resented MacKillop's insistence on leading the sisters herself instead of handing over the authority to the local diocese. This even led to MacKillop being briefly excommunicated for insubordination, a charge that was later reversed. MacKillop and Woods also had a personal falling out due to MacKillop's loosening of the rule of life that they had previously agreed upon after she had gained papal approval for the religious congregation, a move that Woods resented because he felt it would compromise the sisters' dedication. Although MacKillop and Woods reconciled with each other before his death from paralysis at the age of 56, he was never involved with the congregation again. Despite all these setbacks, the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart, also known as the Josephites or Brown Joeys because of the color of their habit, continues to serve, and it now has around 850 members working throughout Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and Peru, ministering to the poor, the uneducated, and the marginalized. Mary MacKillop died at the age of 67 from complications of a stroke and was later canonized by Pope Benedict XVI on 2010, making her the first Australian saint officially recognised by the Catholic Church. May 11, 1868. Algiers, Algeria. Charles Lovigeri begins his missionary work in Africa. Despite Christianity being around for 1,800 years at this point, there were still places in the world that were relatively untouched by the gospel, especially the African continent. In 1868, one of the greatest missionaries of the 19th century arrives in Algiers, the capital city of Algeria, which is in North Africa. His name was Charles Marshal Allemand Lovigéry, and by this time, he had already proven his mettle in administrative matters. Lovigéry was born in Paris and was ordained a priest when he came of age, taking on the job as a teacher of religious history in the local theological college. He was promoted to director of the Oriental schools and had to travel to the Middle East to oversee these academic outposts, and it was there that he first came into contact with Islam and quickly realized that his true vocation in life was to convert the Muslim world. Lovigéry specifically requested for a post in the largely Islamic Africa and was soon given the rank of Archbishop for the recently vacant See of Algiers. He quickly put his organizational skills to good use and brought about a very meticulous and systematic way of evangelizing the entire country, combining both catechesis with charity works and a strident opposition to the slave trade, all of which were badly needed in the famine and poverty-stricken region. His efforts were so successful that the Governor-General of Algeria even attempted to block his ministry, fearing that the Islamic faith had to be protected from proselytizing. Lovigéry soon established the Order of the White Fathers, sending out some of its missionary members to the remotest African regions such as the Sahara, Congo, Sudan, Tunis, Tripoli, and East Africa. Pope Pius IX strongly supported his efforts and even placed the entire Equatorial Africa under his charge. Charles Lovigéry died at the age of 67 after years of failing health. Although his dream of Christianizing the whole African continent fell short, he and his fellow missionaries were responsible for a vast number of conversions, the most significant of which were the Nigerian martyrs Charles Lwanga and his companions. Lovigéry also managed to resurrect the long-dead ecclesiastical see of Saint Cyprian in Carthage, before which he was recognized and raised to the rank of cardinal. His efforts laid the foundation of much of the future missionary work, in this dark part of the world where the light of Christ is needed the most. December 8, 1869. Vatican City. The First Vatican Council commences. As the second half of the 19th century was in full swing, the Catholic Church was on the defensive. The mood of the time was categorized by a massive attack on religion brought about by the post-Enlightenment period. Science and rationality were elevated to an almost godlike status, and people across the world were slowly being seduced with the notion that faith was an antiquated set of beliefs that only the ignorant and those who were easily manipulated ascribed to. In response to this, Pope Pius IX initiates the 20th Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. This was the first council held since the Council of Trent some 300 years prior, and it was also the first council to be convened in the Vatican Basilica instead of the usual Lateran Basilica, hence the name the First Vatican Council, or Vatican I for short. Since the Pope never gave an agenda, the initial meetings of the 744 attendees were reported to be extremely awkward. Cardinal Henry Manning famously stated that all everyone did was stare at each other for long periods of time, engage in mindless chatter, and read magazines out of boredom. Eventually, the council settled on two key issues: the notion of papal infallibility and the nature of the Church. The first issue was definitively settled and turned into a dogma, while the second was only partially covered because the Franco-Prussian and Italian unification wars suddenly broke out, interrupting the council and forcing the bishops to run for their lives. Although it was expected to resume after the hostilities were over, this never came into fruition as the Kingdom of Italy eventually occupies Rome, marking the defeat of the Papal States and turning Pope Pius IX into a prisoner. The First Vatican Council was formally closed by Pope John XXIII almost 100 years later in 1960, prior to the start of the Second Vatican Council. Other than the dogma of papal infallibility, one of the most important consequences of Vatican I was the explicit condemnation of almost all modernist movements such as rationalism, liberalism, naturalism, materialism, and pantheism. This led to multiple nations retaliating by hastening their decision to separate the Church and the state, leading to the rise of many of the current Western style of secular, non-religious politics that are now commonplace in the modern world. July 18, 1870. Vatican City. Papal primacy, perpetuity, and infallibility are declared as dogmas. One of the two apostolic constitutions that came about as a result of the First Vatican Council is called Pastor Eternus, or Eternal Shepherd. In it, the Council Fathers introduced three new dogmas of the Catholic Church. First, it declared that Peter was given prime of place among the apostles, which means that he is the supreme head of the Church, over and above all the other bishops. Second, it declared that this primacy would be handed on in perpetuity through all his successors in the Episcopal See of Rome. Finally, in virtue of receiving the keys of the kingdom from Christ himself, the First Vatican Council formally taught that, when speaking in a definitive manner on matters of faith and morals that are applicable to the whole Church, the Pope would be considered infallible, that is, protected from error of any kind. This is also known as an ex cathedra statement. Because this dogma is based on an ancient tradition stretching back to the early Church, this means that all papal statements made prior to 1870 can also be considered an infallible statement provided that they meet the right criteria. In other words, the dogma of infallibility doesn't just begin in 1870, but can be retroactively applied to all previous generations of popes as well. While there was almost universal acceptance among the bishops concerning these three new declarations, the response of the laity was largely mixed. Some Catholics even formed the Old Catholic Church movement, which is a group of churches that schismed and broke away from Rome because they could not accept the decisions of the Council. Likewise, the response of the secular world was almost overwhelmingly negative, with many nations such as Britain and Germany publicly proclaiming that the Pope was out to destroy rule of law and replace individual freedom with religious tyranny and hegemony. The declaration of papal infallibility eventually led to Austria annulling its concordat with the Holy See, France enshrining the separation of church and state in its national constitution, and the immediate start of the Kulturkampf conflict in the Kingdom of Prussia. Today, although it's a formally defined dogma, most Catholics are still grappling with the issue of the Pope's supreme authority, second only to Christ. September 20, 1870. Rome, Italy. The Papal States are captured and dissolved. Increasing nationalism and frustration over clerical corruption led to calls for the multiple territories of the Italian peninsula to unify themselves under a single monarchy called the Kingdom of Italy. One roadblock to this quest for Italian unification was the existence of the Papal States. The Papal States were ancient parcels of land that were under the direct governance of the Pope, and they ran through important areas of the region, including Rome itself, which was seen by many people as the de facto capital of the Italian kingdom due to its historical prominence. Despite multiple requests by the Kingdom of Italy for the Pope to peacefully surrender the Papal States over to them, the Holy See led by Pius IX refused these terms, prompting the Italian troops to try to take them by force. The Pope requested the aid of many Catholic European nations for military protection, but this request was largely ignored except for France, which provided a garrison around Rome that kept the Italian troops at bay. The opportunity for an attack came in July 1870, after the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War forced the French government to withdraw its troops from Rome, leaving Pius IX practically defenseless. The Kingdom of Italy then swiftly annexed Rome and its surrounding areas in September, completing their plans for unification and declaring an end to the Papal States, but they left Vatican Hill largely undisturbed out of deference to the Pope and the Catholic citizens of Italy. Pius IX protested this annexation by declaring himself a prisoner in the Vatican, and subsequently refused to leave the Apostolic Palace until his death at the age of 85 from epilepsy. This tradition of self-imposed detention was kept by the future popes for the next 59 years, all the way up to Pius XI, when the Kingdom of Italy finally reached a compromise with the Holy See. In exchange for the Pope's recognition of the legitimacy of the reunified Italian kingdom, the government would give the Pope his own independent stretch of land from which to rule from, free of Italian control. This led to the creation of the present-day Vatican City-State and brought an end to the hostilities between the Catholic Church and the secular Italian government. Much like the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, the dissolution of the 1,000-year-old Papal States left a hole in the hearts of many European Catholics, and caused them to ponder the question of the Church's right to hold temporal power, a question that still remains unanswered to this day. 1872. Kingdom of Prussia, Germany. The Kulturkampf conflict begins. As a result of the rapid spread of modern ideologies such as secularism, materialism, nationalism, and the Enlightenment, the Catholic Church found itself at odds with a rising number of people who wanted to bring about the complete separation of religion and politics in all matters of civic life. This conflict was later called Kulturkampf, which is a German word that means culture struggle. Kulturkampf raged across Europe in the latter part of the 19th century, as many liberal politicians and aristocrats wanted to completely secularize their countries and cut off all ties to the waning powers of the Catholic Church, which they saw as a threat because of its staunch opposition to divorce, civil marriages, freedom of religion, and various other modernist agendas. This conflict was especially apparent in the Kingdom of Prussia, as the two sides used whatever means they could think of to undermine the other. For instance, the Vatican pronounced a series of anti-modernist encyclicals and doctrines, the most alarming of which was the dogma of papal infallibility, which was viewed by its opponents as the Church's way of guaranteeing the allegiance of Catholic laymen over and above everything else, including at the expense of their own countries. Secular politicians retaliated by enacting the Falk Laws in 1873, which expelled all religious orders from the Prussian Empire and placed education at the hands of the state. Although the hostilities between the two sides never escalated into large-scale violence, there were multiple imprisonments, fines, and property confiscations, mostly among the clergy. Kulturkampf finally declined in 1878 as the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck became more concerned with the threat of socialism and realized that he needed the Catholic Church's support to help stave it off. Likewise, the recently elected Pope Leo XIII had a more pragmatic and conciliatory approach on the matter compared to his hardline predecessor Pius IX. The state represented by Bismarck and the Catholic Church represented by Leo XIII finally signed several mitigation and peace laws, outlining the rights and responsibilities of both parties and coming to an amicable agreement. The power of the Church in Europe was restored, leading to a massive religious revival. Kulturkampf ended in May 23, 1887 upon Leo XIII's official announcement. Although it was seen as a resounding victory for the faithful and the Catholic Church, this was largely short-lived, as many of the agendas pushed by the Kulturkampf revolutionaries eventually became popular among the masses and are now widely accepted and institutionalized in many parts of the modern world, including almost the entire Western Hemisphere. May 10, 1873. Molokai, Hawaii. Damien de Foister ministers to the lepers. Leprosy or Hansen's disease is a debilitating bacterial infection that leads to various skin rashes and the loss of sensation. It has plagued humanity for thousands of years, being one of the illnesses that is famously referred to multiple times in the Bible. Because of the condition's ability to spread through close contact, lepers are often isolated in colonies far away from the cities. As such, leprosy has a great social stigma attached to it. One of these leper colonies was in the Kalaupapa Peninsula of Molokai, a Hawaiian government-mandated settlement. The settlement was in dire need of a missionary, but very few Christians were willing to go and evangelize to the lepers because of the almost suicidal nature of the job. Even the bishop in charge of the area only asked for volunteers, because he felt that ordering a priest under the vow of obedience would be a step too far. Thankfully, one Belgian-born cleric, Damien de Foister of the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, decided that this was his calling in life. He arrived on the island in 1873 and found that the approximately 600 quarantined lepers had given themselves over to drunken and lewd conduct because of their separation from society, lack of resources and opportunities, and the general despair that constantly hung over them. Father Damien vowed in his opening address that he would treat them like they were his own children, and that he was willing to live and die with them. Both of these promises were kept, as Damien quickly took charge and led the lepers in building a church, a reservoir, roads, hospitals, and various homes and furniture in order to elevate their living conditions. He also improved their social outlook by organizing various activities, creating workshops to improve their skills, and teaching them the Catholic faith, reminding the lepers that they were beautiful in the eyes of God, no matter what the outside world might think of them. Other men and women, inspired by Father Damien's courage, decided to join his missionary endeavors. Chief among them were the American Civil War veteran Joseph Dutton and the religious sister Marianne Cope, both of whom provided invaluable assistance to Father Damien. One day, while bathing, Father Damien accidentally dipped his foot in a bucket of boiling water and felt nothing. After 11 years of cleaning the lepers' wounds and burying their dead, he had finally contracted the disease himself. Damien de Foister soon died at the age of 49 from leprosy. The entire colony attended his funeral procession and laid him to rest beneath the very same tree that he had slept under when he had first stepped foot in the island more than a decade ago. When the Belgian government asked for his body back, the lepers requested that his right hand be severed and kept in the grave, the same hand that was not afraid to touch them, and this request was granted. Damien de Foister was canonized in 2009 by Pope Benedict XVI. He is affectionately known as the Apostle of the Lepers, a title that calls to mind Jesus himself, who healed by the touch of his hand those who were suffering, and did not hesitate to treat those who were ostracized by society with the same human dignity that they truly deserve. 1875. Wales, United Kingdom. Gerard Manley Hopkins composes The Wreck of the Deutschland. On December 6, 1875, an iron passenger steamship by the name of SS Deutschland was sailing from Bremen to New York when it encountered a heavy blizzard and ran aground. The gale-force winds and the lack of proper leadership and rescue personnel caused heavy panic among the passengers, many of whom were European emigrants on their way to settle in the United States. Among these emigrants were 5 nuns from the Franciscan Sisters of the Sacred Hearts, who were forcibly evicted from the Prussian Empire because of the anti-Catholic Kulturkampf movement that was prevalent at that time. 157 people did not survive the sinking of the ship, including the 5 nuns, with one of them forever lost at sea and never recovered. This incident caused Jesuit priest and poet Gerard Manley Hopkins to compose his greatest work called The Wreck of the Deutschland, which is a 35-stanza ode dedicated to the drowned sisters that dramatizes the event with the overarching message of trusting in God's divine plan for humanity, despite tragic circumstances. Although Hopkins is now considered one of the greatest Victorian poets, especially because of his pioneering work in the use of sprung rhythm, he was not appreciated during his lifetime, and The Wreck of the Deutschland was accepted by a magazine but never published, leading to his disillusionment as a writer. It was only after his death from typhoid fever at the age of 44 that his genius was discovered, when his friend Robert Bridges made a concerted effort to spread his poems. Although Hopkins battled constant depression and mediocrity all throughout his short life, his last words were supposedly, "I am so happy. I am so happy. I loved my life." It may be the case that The Wreck of the Deutschland was not merely a dramatic tale of the victims of the ship, but also a message of hope dedicated to anyone who looks forward to the expectation that God will be kinder to them on the other side of the curtain of death than he was on this side. August 4, 1879. Vatican City. Leo XIII orders a revival of traditional Christian philosophy. Barely 18 months into his pontificate, the recently elected Pope Leo XIII decided to take the bold step of ordering a full revival of classic Christian philosophy, specifically that of scholasticism, which was the method used in the Middle Ages by the great St. Thomas Aquinas. This was due to the fact that secular thought was steadily taking over many of the Catholic schools and institutions as a result of the post-Enlightenment period. Reason was being perceived by many as superior to faith, and hence belief in God and the study of theology was slowly being eroded in favor of a more scientific approach. In response to this encroachment, Leo XIII released his encyclical Aeterni Patris, or of the Eternal Father, in 1879, ordering all Catholic schools to change their curriculum to resist modern trends and return to a more traditional Christian approach. The document also clarified that true philosophy involves a dialectic between faith and reason, reiterating once again that the two should never be pitted in conflict, nor should one be elevated at the expense of the other. This move by the Pope was seen as courageous, since previous popes had only condemned the rising tide of rationalism, but hadn't really advocated a full return to the roots of the Catholic intellectual tradition. Pope Leo XIII died of natural causes at the age of 93, and attorney Pat Rees has had a widespread effect in re-establishing St. Thomas Aquinas as the ideal role model and preeminent figure among theologians well into the 20th century. August 21, 1879. Knock, Ireland. The Holy Family appears to Mary Byrne and her companions. Going home on a rainy Thursday night, Mary Byrne suddenly stops in her tracks as she spots what appears to be mysterious figures hovering over the gable of a nearby church. She runs back to her neighborhood and alerts her relatives and friends. The group of about 15 people quickly return to the site in order to confirm the apparition. According to eyewitness testimony, the mysterious figures included a woman believed to be the Virgin Mary wearing a white cloak, an older man believed to be Saint Joseph standing at her right side, and a younger man believed to be Saint John the Apostle wearing a bishop's mitre and standing at her left side. Behind Saint John was an altar surrounded by angels, on top of which stood a cross and a lamb believed to be Jesus Christ himself. Unlike other Marian apparitions, the vision at Knock was unique in that the entire Holy Family was present, including the beloved disciple. Also unique to this apparition was that no messages were relayed at all. The figures remained completely silent and presented themselves to the witnesses, who stood in the nighttime downpour in deep prayer and contemplation, for approximately 2 hours before disappearing. After an official inquiry by the Catholic Church, the apparition was deemed valid and worthy of belief. The Virgin Mary's appearance will later be known as Our Lady of Knock, Queen of Ireland. Although the original wall where the apparition manifested itself was slowly chipped away throughout the decades by eager pilgrims who wanted to bring home a souvenir of the relic, Knock is still the site of major Catholic pilgrimages today, and several churches have been built around the area to commemorate the event. Modern theologians are still baffled by the significance of this apparition due to the lack of communication by Mary, Joseph, and John, but in a way, the sighting at Knock might be a message in itself, indicating that God is still present in the silence of our lives, even if we have no idea what He's trying to tell us. April 6, 1885. Maryland, USA. The Baltimore Catechism is published. Due to a lack of an organized and up-to-date catechism for the teaching of Christian doctrine in American schools, the United States bishops who assembled in the First Provincial Council of Baltimore decided to create one themselves. It was to be based on an old catechism that was written by Saint Robert Bellarmine during the Protestant Schism, and it had to be approved by the Holy See. Several decades passed before this desire would come into fruition, and it finally happened in 1885 as the book titled A Catechism of Christian Doctrine, prepared and enjoined by order of the Third Council of Baltimore, or the Baltimore Catechism for short, was published. Because of the Council's desire to make this catechism as perfect as possible, nearly all the bishops in the United States were required to review and sign off on it. Many Catholic schools in America soon adopted it into their curriculum, and it became the most popular catechism in print until the Universal Catechism of the Catholic Church, published and promulgated by Pope John Paul II in 1992, replaced it. Today, although the Baltimore Catechism is no longer as prestigious and common as it once was, it's still preferred by some Catholics because of its easy-to-read nature, illustrated drawings, and the unique question and answer format that it uses. June 3, 1886. Namugongo, Kingdom of Buganda. Charles Wanga Burns at the stake. Christianity spread to Africa mostly by the efforts of the White Fathers, a religious missionary order founded by Cardinal Charles Lovigeri. One of the areas that they worked in was the Kingdom of Buganda, headed by King Mutesa, who received them peacefully. The priests were allowed to spread Catholicism without much interference by the state, and as a result, multiple young pages in the king's court converted after being catechized properly. Events took a turn for the worse, however, when the relatively level-headed King Mutesa died and was succeeded by his corrupt son Mwanga. a pedophile who lusted after boys and would constantly engage in ritual sexual intercourse with them. Because Catholicism considered such actions as intrinsically evil, Mwanga was soon met with severe resistance from his young pages. Enraged, he quickly banned Christianity and executed those who opposed him. His chief page, the 25-year-old Catholic convert Charles Lwanga, realized the danger he was in after he tried to protect the younger boys from the king's amorous advances, and quickly asked to be baptized by the White Fathers along with the other catechumens. King Mwanga soon summoned Charles and 14 others to his court after learning about their Christianity and ordered them to renounce the religion, to which they flatly refused. Enraged, the king had them bound together and forced on a 2-day march to Namugongo to be burned at the stake. One of the boys was chopped into pieces and left to die by the side of the road after he boldly proclaimed that God would rescue him. When the remaining martyrs reached the site of their execution, they were held in captive for 1 week while the king's soldiers prepared their funeral pyre. Charles Lwanga was separated from the group since he was their de facto leader and was tortured severely prior to being killed. After his feet were slowly burned until only the charred stumps remained, he was given one last chance by his captors to renounce Christianity and live. Charles and his companions stood firm, and they were all incinerated to death on the same day. Overall, King Mwanga's persecution resulted in the executions of 100 Christians, most of whom were between the ages of 13 and 25, a remarkable feat of fortitude that testifies to the heroism available to the youth. Charles Lwanga and the Ugandan martyrs were canonized by Pope Paul VI in 1964. The Basilica of the Uganda martyrs was also built over the site of their execution in Namugongo and serves as their shrine. Today, over 84% of the Ugandan population professes faith in Christ, marking the complete victory of the cross over the forces of evil that sought to extinguish it. June 21, 1888. Santiago, Chile. The Pontifical Catholic University of Chile is founded. One of the oldest universities in Chile is the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, or UC for short. It had its meager beginnings in June 1888 when the Santiago Archbishop decided to found a school in order to teach law and mathematics to some of the local citizens. As the years went by, these initial courses began to include other fields such as business, chemistry, accounting, science, and engineering. The school's student population as well as its boundaries started to expand, until it finally amassed an almost 615,000 square meter area divided across 4 campuses. The UC's track record is so flawless that the Chilean government decided to grant it full academic autonomy in 1931, and Pope Pius XI declared it as a pontifical university in 1930, one of the only 2 in the country. Today, the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile has over 23,000 undergraduates and 4,000 postgraduates and is ranked as the #1 university in the entire Latin American region, proving once again that reason and faith do not oppose, but rather elevate each other to their full potential. May 15, 1891. Vatican City. Leo XIII defines the Church's stance on capital and labor. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, unrestricted capitalism was becoming the norm, with factories and other conglomerates taking advantage of cheap and easily replaceable labor by subjecting the working class to substandard and even dangerous conditions, providing them no recourse to air their grievances because of the threat of unemployment. In retaliation to this social conflict between the rich and the poor, other dangerous economic ideologies began to take root such as communism and socialism. Pope Leo XIII responded to this increasingly volatile class warfare by releasing his encyclical Rerum Novarum, or of revolutionary change. In it, the Pope outlines the rights as well as the responsibilities of both capital and labor, famously arguing that it's not enough for the employer and employee simply to agree on a certain wage, but that both parties must go above and beyond their own interests and do what's best for the other in order to ameliorate the misery and wretchedness that is especially prevalent among poor workers. The Pope also encouraged the formation of trade unions and the practice of collective bargaining and subsidiarity as a way of balancing the distribution of power and preventing unnecessary state intervention. Socialism was likewise denounced, and the right of all men to own private property was affirmed. Rerum Novarum has since become a landmark of Catholic social and moral teaching, especially on issues that concern the economy, and has laid the foundation for what will later be known as the preferential option for the poor. Multiple popes have since expanded on Leo XIII's encyclical, and economic justice is even more relevant today as it was during his time. August 16, 1891. Manila, Philippines. San Sebastian Church is completed. One of the most beautiful churches in the world is the San Sebastian Church located in Manila. Construction first began in 1621 after a rich patron named Bernardino Castillo donated a large parcel of land for the project, with the request that the church be named after his favorite saint, the Roman martyr Sebastian, who was killed during the Diocletian persecution. The materials used for the church were originally wood and rock, but these were easily destroyed by a series of earthquakes, which are quite common in the Philippines. Fed up with the never-ending repairs, the parish priest Esteban Martinez finally approached a Spanish architect named Genaro Palacios and ordered him to rebuild the church using the strongest components possible so that it will be immune from future damage. Palacios thought that the best way to do this was to create the building entirely out of metal. He then ordered 52 tons of prefabricated steel from Belgium and reinforced them with sand, gravel, and cement. Work began in 1888 and ended 3 years later in 1891. The final product was a masterpiece of engineering and architecture, completely fire and earthquake-proof. Not only that, the church's fusion of Baroque and Neo-Gothic style was so beautiful that it started to attract tourists and even appeared on the UNESCO list, encouraging the Filipino government to declare it as a national historical landmark and cultural treasure. Today, San Sebastian Church remains the only steel church in Asia, and was raised to the status of a minor basilica by Pope Leo XIII on June 1890. November 30, 1894. Vatican City. Leo XIII preserves the traditions of the Eastern Catholic churches. The vast majority of Catholics around the world are members of the Roman or Western Church. There is a very small group, however, who belong to the Eastern churches that make up approximately 1.5% of the total Catholic population. These are the churches that are in full communion with Rome and the Pope, but because of vast geographical distances, ended up culturally and physically isolated from the West, resulting in the development of their own traditions throughout the centuries. For example, many of them use a different liturgical rite to celebrate Mass, are governed by a separate code of canon law, and do not impose clerical celibacy on their priests, allowing them to marry as they see fit. In response to an alarming trend of trying to impose Western standards on these churches, Pope Leo XIII released his encyclical Orientalium Dignitas, or On the Churches of the East, in 1894, fully establishing the rights of the Eastern Catholics to practice and preserve their own unique way of doing things, as well as strictly forbidding anyone from overturning these ancient traditions in favor of a more Latin style. The Pope encouraged the Eastern Catholics to hold fast to their witness of faith, emphasizing that the unity of the Church doesn't mean that every single diocese has to adhere to mechanical uniformity, but is rather made manifest by a variety of customs and rites that are centered on the one principle, who is Christ the Lord. This encyclical is also a reminder for missionaries to integrate other nations' native and ethnic practices into the fullness of the Catholic Church, where they can be transformed to serve the world, instead of supplanting them in favor of their own biases, provided that these practices aren't against the natural law. May 1896. New York, USA. Mark Twain publishes personal recollections of Joan of Arc. When the young Samuel Langhorne Clemens was only a teenager, he found a leaflet that told about the life of Joan of Arc. Clemens became fascinated with the figure, immediately wondering if the almost mythical woman presented in the story was a real person. As he grew older, Clemens found immense popularity as a writer, taking on the pen name Mark Twain. By this point, Twain had become a strident opponent of organized religion, specifically the Catholic faith, and was even a member of Freemasonry, a group that has always been at odds with the Church. Nevertheless, His obsession with Joan of Arc remained with him for 40 years, well into his adulthood, until finally, he began writing about her in Harper's Magazine beginning April 1895. Unlike many of his other novels, Twain spent a considerable amount of time on the work, dedicating 12 years' worth of research and 2 years' worth of writing until it was finally published in a complete format in May 1896 under the title, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. The book is a fairly detailed biography told through a fictionalized lens. It's divided into 3 parts and recounts the life of Saint Joan as a youth in Domremy, then as a commander of the French army under King Charles VII, and finally as a martyr by fire in Rouen. Departing from his usual comic style, Twain wrote with all seriousness and sincerity, treating the subject matter with the dignity that it deserves. Reactions to the novel were mixed, with some criticizing the author for being infatuated with and hero-worshipping the female saint, but Twain himself considered it his greatest masterpiece, even commenting that it was far superior to his most popular works such as Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain died of a heart attack at the age of 74, and Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc was to be his last novel. Although he never became a Catholic, his life reminds us of the fact that Christ has multiple ways of drawing people into his arms, and one of these is by making them fall in love with the men and women who bear his image the most. September 13, 1896. Vatican City. Leo XIII declares all Anglican ordinations as invalid. The Anglican Communion is the third largest Christian communion with over 85 million members worldwide. Although its historical roots go as far back as the 1st century, the Anglicans split with the Catholic Church in 1534 after King Henry VIII was refused an annulment from his wife Catherine of Aragon, and subsequently declared himself the head of the Church of England instead of the Pope. Since then, the Anglicans have been infected with various Protestant heresies, even though they still perform many of the sacraments such as confession and the Eucharist. It has always been assumed that the priests and bishops of the Anglican churches lacked sacramental validity, but this was only formally declared in 1896 when Pope Leo XIII released his papal bull Apostolicae Curae, or of the Apostolic Care, which officially rendered all Anglican ordinations as absolutely null and utterly void, since they lacked both form and intention, and especially because they sought to create a priesthood that was separate from the sacrificing priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church. This meant that all the priests and bishops of the Anglican Communion had no valid authority and would have to convert to Catholicism if they ever wanted to keep their vocation in the true and proper sense. Although some prominent Anglicans, such as the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, denounced the papal bull, it was largely ignored due to the fact that the schism was already well established at that point. Today, the ruling still stands, especially since the Anglican Communion have begun to accept female clerics within their ranks, which is directly opposed to the sacred tradition of a male-only priesthood. Catholics are therefore not allowed to receive the sacraments from Anglican ministers, and those Anglican prelates who wish to return to the Roman Catholic Church would have to be reordained in order to be fully recognized as legitimate. May 28, 1898. Turin, Kingdom of Italy. Secondo Pia photographs the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is a 4.4 by 1.1 meter fabric that contains the full-length, front and back image of a naked man lying down with his hands crossed over his groin. It was first discovered in the year 1354 and has since ignited a firestorm of controversy because of its mysterious nature. Despite decades of modern scientific testing, no one really knows how the man's appearance managed to get imprinted onto the cloth fabric. To make matters more complicated, the man is clearly suffering from some kind of abuse and torture, due to the presence of large stains on his forehead, hands, and feet. Christians throughout the years have increasingly come to believe that this is the actual burial shroud that was used after Jesus' crucifixion, and the man in the fabric is none other than Christ himself, but this claim has always lacked justification because of the blurry nature of the image. It wasn't until 1898 when the full magnificence of this miraculous icon was discovered. An attorney by the name of Secondo Pia was contracted by the Turin Cathedral to photograph the shroud as part of their anniversary exhibit. Cameras were a recent invention at the time, and Pierre was one of the pioneers of this art form. After he took the necessary shots, he and 2 other men went into their dark room to develop what they had taken. What Pierre discovered almost made him drop the glass plate in shock. Whereas the actual face on the shroud itself was barely recognizable, the negative or reverse plate on the black and white photograph revealed the full features of the man, something that could not have been seen by the naked eye alone. Although the Catholic Church has not formally endorsed or rejected the miraculous nature of the shroud, Pierre's famous photograph has been used as part of the Holy Face medal promoted by Sister Maria Pierina de Micheli. Pope Pius XII also approved the devotion to the Holy Face of Jesus and turned it into a feast on the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday. Secondo Pierre died of natural causes on September 7, 1941, 2 days before his 86th birthday. The shroud is currently kept in the Turin Cathedral, and a modern field called Syndenology that is dedicated to studying it has been established. September 30, 1898. Normandy, France. Thérèse Martin's The Story of a Soul is published. One of the greatest saints that the Catholic Church has ever produced came in the form of a beautiful and precocious girl by the name of Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin. She was born into a highly spiritual household of Catholics who not only taught her the faith but actually demonstrated it, so much so that Thérèse and her 4 older sisters all ended up becoming nuns. After a rough start because of her young age, Thérèse managed to obtain permission from the local bishop and became a postulant in the cloistered Carmelite community of Lisieux. She made her vows at 17 years old and took on the religious name Thérèse of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. Over the next 9 years, Thérèse would spend an almost exclusively sheltered life, hardly leaving the convent and taking on various jobs such as becoming a sacristan and an assistant to the novice mistress. Tragedy would strike as she contracted tuberculosis, leading to a slow and painful decline that ultimately ended her life at the age of 24. Thérèse would have joined the Church's ranks of holy but unknown women if not for the fact that her sisters published her spiritual memoir posthumously titled The Story of a Soul, 1 year later on her death anniversary. This autobiography was composed of 3 parts. The first was a brief recollection of Thérèse's upbringing, the second was a summary of her spiritual worldview, and the third contained details of her religious life. Not expecting much of it, the nuns of Thérèse's order were surprised that all the limited copies of the memoir were suddenly sold out within 6 months. More copies were published, and soon, pirated and unauthorized versions were distributed everywhere as the Carmelites could no longer keep up with the demand. The explosive popularity of the work with the general public was due in part to Thérèse's clear-cut explanation on how to achieve sanctity in everyday life, something that was within the reach of the average Catholic layperson. Her philosophy, now known as the Little Way, was so influential that she was canonized in 1925 by Pope Pius XI only 28 years after her death, and was declared a Doctor of the Church by Pope John Paul II in 1997, making her the youngest person to ever receive this rare title and one of only 4 women. Her parents, Zélie and Louis Martin, also became the first married couple to be canonized together, and it is expected that Thérèse's other sisters may join them as well, proving that it is possible for an entire family to become saints. Today, Thérèse's original manuscripts are now available for reading online, and her greatest contribution to the Church always remains in the fact that she showed people how to become servants of God even when stuck in the most obscure and unfashionable paths of life, away from the limelight of the world. This is the end of Milestones of the Catholic Church, 19th century. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.